Alio?
Paul, I need your help.
Arranging an interview with Stalin.
Go see Walter Duranty at the New York Times.
Listen, I really need to talk to you. I found something big. You can break this story wide open.
Mr. Jones.
Mr. Duranty.
So why are you really here?
I need your help.
This is Ada Brooks. She's my star.
What do you want?
The story no one is talking about.
Ukraine.
Stalin's gold.
You will retract your statements to the press immediately.
Or they will shoot our engineers.
You actually thought you could interview Stalin and make some kind of difference, didn't you?
I guess the agenda now.
I don't have an agenda, unless you call truth an agenda.
I'm Sarah Kenzier, the author of the best-selling books The View from Flyover Country and Hiding in Plain Sight.
I'm Andrea Chalupa, a journalist and filmmaker, and the writer and producer of the journalistic thriller Mr. Jones, which is
Sorry.
You hold on a second. Mr. Jones is available now for rent. Okay, you could rent it now. Just go to my Twitter and you'll see all these links on where you can rent it right now in the US. And then it's coming to the US and Canada on June 19th, and everyone can buy it and watch it. It's going to be great. All right, go ahead, Sarah.
Okay, and this is Gaslit Nation, a podcast covering corruption in the Trump administration and rising autocracy around the world and the global pandemic, but we'll get to that later. For now, we're going to start with a old Gaslit Nation topic that unfortunately never goes away, which is the topic of illicit election interference. Right now, Trump is yet again creating an election rigging narrative very similar to the one that his team devised in 2016. In that narrative, where he continually claimed that the election could be rigged, that ended up prompting the Democrats in 2016 to respond that elections in America could never be rigged, meaning that when the Republicans, with help from abroad, did rig the election, the Democrats were backed into a corner and could not discuss the illicit activity after the election without seeming disingenuous and defensive. Now the situation has become even more complicated because of coronavirus. The current battle is about vote by mail, and it's an extension of the battle over hand-marked paper ballots versus machine voting that we've seen going on for years. And you can listen to a very early Gaslit Nation episode from 2018. I think our fourth episode was on election integrity and hacked ballots. So go check that out. This is a long-term problem, and the election of this and any U.S. election was always in jeopardy for a variety of reasons. You have domestic voter suppression resulting in part from the partial repeal of the VRA in 2013. You have foreign interference, primarily from Russia, but not exclusively. You have the fact that voting machines are insecure. For that, you can consult the Twitter account and the articles of Jenny Cohn, who goes into great detail about how these machines could be hacked. And you even have warnings from people like Harry Reid back in 2016, who warned that Russia intended to, quote, falsify official election results. And James Comey, who was the person he warned about this, utterly ignored it. And so now we have the GOP yet again doing everything possible to prevent what for them would be a worst case scenario, which is a high turnout election done exclusively with paper ballots. And their tactics for this include vowing to shut down the U.S. Postal Service by July using the coronavirus as a pretext, filling top Postal Service positions with Trump lackeys, and then conspiratorial tirades about voting by mail, such as these tweets from Trump that came this morning. This is Tuesday morning that I'm about to read, where he says, "There is no way, zero, that mail-in ballots will be anything less than substantially fraudulent. Mailboxes will be robbed, ballots will be forged, and even illegally printed out and fraudulently signed. The governor of California, sending ballots to millions of people, anyone living in the state, no matter who they are or how they got there, will get one. Well, good. That will be followed up with professionals telling all of these people, many of whom have never even thought of voting before, how and for whom to vote. This will be a rigged election. No way. I mean, first of all, like, a lot of what he's complaining about is just very good. Like, yes, you should be able to access a ballot. Yes, it should be easy for you to vote. Yes, you should be able to vote for who you want. And these basic rights, which Trump does not ever refer to as rights, he recently called this an honor. And generally speaking, the GOP has viewed it as a privilege, and it's one that they only want Republican voters to have. That's the hallmarks of a democracy. But they do not want a democracy. They want a one-party mafia state. They want an autocracy with Donald Trump at the helm. And so adding to this, unfortunately, the danger is not just talk. The GOP is suing Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, over his vote by mail executive order, where he's saying that residents of California must vote by mail. Trump is also threatening to deny federal funding in general to Michigan and to Nevada if they choose to vote by mail. The Las Vegas Sun says President Donald Trump on Wednesday threatened to hold up federal funds for 2 election battleground states that are trying to make it easier and safer to vote during the coronavirus pandemic. The president's tweets targeting Nevada and Michigan marked an escalation in his campaign against voting by mail. So in summary, this is an assault on democracy. It's a continuation of a long attack on voting rights, made all the more dangerous by the genuine danger of the pandemic and the willingness of the GOP to exploit it for their ultimate goal, which, as I said, a one-party mafia state. So Andrea, what are your thoughts?
Well, if you wanted the U.S. to break apart into different republics where the United States no longer is the United States, but more like a European Union, the easiest way is for the far right to keep stealing presidential elections, keep stealing the Electoral College. So twice in our lifetime, Sarah, we had Republicans win the Electoral College and lose the popular vote, which baffles the rest of the world and explains why we are a far-right nation. We're held hostage by a far-right minority. We are a country that can produce incredible universities and intellectuals. We do have intellectuals here in the United States, and innovation and world-leading solutions for the climate catastrophe and so forth. And the explanation of why there are 2 Americas is because why we have 2 Americas is simply because of the Electoral College, a monument to slavery from the American Revolution period, a devil's compromise with states that were afraid of going back to tyranny under a central power like a mad king, King George, and they wanted their independence, and a way to broker that with the slave states, especially that wanted their independence and feared sort of the drumbeat of the abolitionist movement coming for them and so forth, was to have the Electoral College. We've been paying for that devil's compromise for a very long time now. So with Paul Manafort freed from prison and back at home, you have to wonder how much he is participating, if at all, because we know that he broke laws when he was under house arrest previously. And you have to wonder how much he's weighing in on these things and using his dark arts to help the Trump crime family steal another presidential election. We want to remind everyone, Paul Manafort, days before the election in 2016, broke his silence randomly with a tweet predicting that Trump was going to win battleground states, even though that defied all the polling at the time. And everyone was like, what's this guy talking about? And that turned out to be an ominous sign that this election of 2016 was ultimately stolen, as we saw. And then they fought that, and they stole on a variety of fronts, from dark money from Russian sources flooding the GOP, from militarized propaganda from Cambridge Analytica, from the sweeping bot campaign with the Russian bots on every available social media channel in the US, dividing Americans against each other, and so forth. And that's just a quick summary of some of the tactics they relied on to do everything they could to put the Trump crime family over the edge. Plus, there was election hacking in all 50 states. And we don't even know the full extent of that because they've been very reticent in sharing with us what they know. And a whistleblower from a contractor of the NSA who dared to share documents, proof of Russia's widespread hacking of our election system, she's now in prison. That's Reality Winner, of course. So she's in prison while Manafort is resting at home during this pandemic. So I point this all out to remind us that if you wanted to achieve Putin's ultimate dream of breaking apart the US, and again, the Kremlin has been extraordinarily friendly with secessionist movements in the US, including Cal-Exit, of course, and so is the far right. And if you wanted to destroy the US from within and finally see us all break apart, then Donald Trump would steal the Electoral College again, and the GOP would gladly help him because they rely on voter disenfranchisement in all its many ways to steal elections. They rely on that as an election strategy. They've come out and said that. We've caught them saying that. And it's so obvious for seeing all these long lines, especially. This happened with George W. Bush in 2004 in Ohio, with long lines magically in Democratic voting districts and so forth, and machines breaking down in those districts conveniently. So it's not inevitable that Joe Biden is going to win the presidential election. And we all have to remind ourselves of that every single day and remind our friends of that every single day, that Joe Biden winning the presidential election in 2020 and being our next president and being sworn in January 2021, that is absolutely not inevitable. Donald Trump and the GOP, the far-right pirates that hijacked the White House in 2016, they could do it again in 2020. They know how. And we're seeing all the familiar signs of that playing out now. Donald Trump continues to do what he got impeached for in front of our eyes, these quid pro quos. He's doing it with the states. He's helping the states that voted for him. It's all happening before our eyes. Again, if you wanted to destroy the US from within, you drive Americans so crazy with this electoral college, determining this other, yet again, a corrupt president as the winner. And what's going to happen is you're going to see successionist movements. You're going to see referendums eventually. There's just so much of this that Americans can take. Why should a state like California be stuck under moocher Mitch McConnell and all the money Kentucky takes from the federal government, money that comes from taxpayers in California and New York? The most recent study we have on this shows that blue states are highly taxed, and they go to the welfare queen red states that aren't as taxed as much. And I use the term welfare queen because that was a racist image that was created by the GOP to hold up African Americans, specifically an African American woman, as being the recipient of welfare programs in America, where in reality, it's far-right states like Mitch McConnell's Kentucky. It's Wall Street socialism, Wall Street getting bailed out. It's all these massive corporations that are first at the trough in the pandemic bailout bills that have come out of Congress. It is the 1% that is the actual welfare queen in our society. And it's the African American communities, communities of color, immigrant communities that are the ones that are holding everyone else up on their backs. Those are the communities that are being taxed and left behind. So we have to remind everyone that a lot of this pandemic is obviously bringing a lot to the surface that we need to address. And this election, of course, is adding to that as well. What could ultimately happen is if the Trump crime family steals this presidential election simply by stealing the Electoral College, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Florida, which could very well happen if you look at GOP-led voting restrictions and racist voting laws and so forth in those states, it could happen again. And what are we left with? You're going to see then dark money from far-right sources, from foreign sources like Russia, feeding these secessionist movements on the left and right. And you're going to see useful idiots on the left and right calling for referendums in California and New York. And that is going to continue and take off should the Trump crime family steal another election. Just to highlight how perfect of a marriage Putin's Kremlin and Mitch McConnell's GOP are. The Republican Party is organized crime. Their ultimate product that they've brought us is Donald Trump. That was the end game of their decades of corruption, their decades of allowing, dark money to flood our politics, their decades of trying to restrict the way we vote and steal the vote. And Putin, of course, just joined forces. They had the same goal in mind, corruption and making money despite the costs, despite whose lives are destroyed in the process. So let me just underline that point by reading from this piece that came out a couple years ago in the LA Times from Connor Friederhoff of how precarious our situation is, that it's not just about Donald Trump stealing this election in 2020 like he did in 2016. It's also about the potential demise, the dissolution of the United States as we know it. Imagine if President Trump announced that he wanted to oust California from the United States. If it weren't for us, after all, Trump would have won the popular vote he so lusts after by 1.4 million. Blue America would lose its biggest source of electoral votes in all future elections. The Senate would have 2 fewer Democrats. The House of Representatives would lose 38 Democrats and just 14 Republicans. The U.S. Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, among the most liberal in the nation, would be changed irrevocably, and the U.S. as a whole would suddenly be a lot less ethnically diverse than it is today. For those reasons, Trump, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, Speaker of the House Paul Ryan, again, this came out, I think, in 2017, Republicans with White House ambitions, opponents of legalizing marijuana, advocates of criminalizing abortion, and various white nationalist groups might all conclude, for different reasons, that they would benefit politically from a separation, even as liberals and progressives across America would correctly see it as a catastrophe. So it makes sense that the leader of the Yes California Independence campaign, Marcus Ruiz Evans, was, contrary to popular assumptions, a registered Republican when he formed the separatist group 2 years ago, according to the San Jose Mercury News. He briefly hosted conservative talk radio shows in Fresno and would not tell the newspaper if he voted for Trump. And of course, you also had a Calexit activist moving to Russia. So we're not just looking at a crisis of Trump staying in power for another 4 years, either by stealing the election or refusing to leave the White House, which is possible. And I know Congress has control over whether the election moves forward or not. But we're looking at a long-term plan in our lifetimes of the U.S. breaking apart. And one thing I learned from being in London during Brexit is that the U.S. and UK are indeed in a special relationship. And what that special relationship is that we both have these influential movements of idiots flooding the ballot box in anger and voting against their own interests and taking that pain out on themselves election cycle after election cycle. That's the US-UK special relationship. It's that we have these very rich, far-right idiots at the top leading the poor idiots like Pied Piper to the ballot box again and again and voting against their own interests and just furthering their own pain and furthering dividing their countries against each other. And so the long term, again, is the US breaking apart. And that's the ultimate danger here, because who the hell wants to live on the border of Kentucky, the Republic of Kentucky, which would probably have an arsenal of nuclear weapons and lack of environmental regulations? Ask Ukraine how it likes living on the border of Russia. And that is why the US breaking apart into separate state nations, republics, is not the answer. Because the federal government, as flawed as our republic is, these red states, if left to their own demise, without the federal government bringing in regulations, thanks to Congress, it could be a lot worse. It could be a lot more dangerous for their blue state neighbors being on the border with some of these rogue states if we were to be separate nations. It's not the answer.
I live in a quote unquote red state. And, one thing that I've been emphasizing from the time that I started writing about the US is that there's no such thing really as a red state or a blue state. There's a purple state. And of course, there's governments that are dominated primarily by Republicans, as they are in Missouri, or primarily by Democrats, as they are in California. And that governance makes a tremendous amount of difference into how people live their lives and what kinds of rights and freedoms that they have. But it doesn't necessarily reflect the culture on the ground because of things like gerrymandering, because of voter suppression. But also, one thing that people tend to miss when they think of a red state, like when you think of Kentucky, like they miss Louisville, they miss diverse cities, they miss cities that are primarily African American or heavily African American, which is true of every red state in the South and is true of every, swing state in the Midwest, and certainly true of where I live in St. Louis. Like these designations are so much more nuanced nuanced and complex that the idea of the United States being broken up into parts, being compartmentalized and sold off, which I completely agree with you is the goal. They basically want to create a breakup of the US similar to the breakup of the Soviet Union and then just hijack the resources. But I think about where I live in St. Louis, which has always been a place of, terrible compromises. The Missouri Compromise comes to mind, and a place where people have tried to make sense of American identity. Like, I'm in a, quote, blue city of St. Louis with purple suburbs in a state that has a red government, but that is made up of a bunch of different communities. The other big cities of Kansas City is also a, quote, blue city. But more to the point, my metro area extends over the Mississippi River well into Illinois, the blue state. And what I'm seeing now, because of the combination of Trump and of our terrible Missouri legislature dominated by the GOP, are people who feel now worried about living in Missouri in the future, hopping over the river to live in Metro St. Louis, but in Illinois, under Illinois laws. And almost everyone I know who's doing this is either somebody who is disabled and worried about their health care, or there's somebody who is Black and they're worried about our racist state government. And this parallels so much what people in the 19th century would do when they lived in St. Louis, when they lived in Missouri, the slave state, and they would try to get over to Illinois, the free state. Like, you may know a novel called Huckleberry Finn, which is about this. The fact that we are still living in that version of America with these state laws that don't reflect the desires of people on the ground and these designations that don't reflect the complexity of the situation is horrifying, but it's just a steady continuation of history. Our flaws were never mended. Our crimes were never remedied. People were never truly held accountable for the original sin of slavery in the United States. And our politics, as Andre already noted with the Electoral College, proceed directly from that. But I would encourage people to not fall for the red state, blue state designation. That was really something invented by cable TV during the 2000 election when they didn't know who was going to win. And both parties have seized on it to try to form a cohesive identity for the reason of fundraising and objectifying different political parties and hardening them into, forms of identity associated with race, with religion, with all sorts of things. In reality, it's not black and white, it's gray. It's not red and blue, it's purple. And we are one country, we are one America. And it breaks my heart to think that, maybe in my lifetime, we won't be. I'm happy living where I am. I'm not leaving Missouri. But I'd be crushed, if we didn't have California, if we didn't have Alaska, which is another place that the Russians have had eyes on. And yeah, if we didn't have Kentucky. I think a lot of the red states, quote unquote, including mine, get a very bad, unfair rap in terms of what we've been through in the last 20 years, living under these governments that we didn't necessarily vote for because we haven't had free and fair elections here. We keep trying to clean things up. I mean, in Missouri, there's literally an initiative that a huge majority of state voters voted for called Clean Missouri to get rid of gerrymandering, to get rid of dark money. And now our Republican legislature is destroying it. So whatever we do, when we try to clean up our own messes, it gets destroyed by powers with a lot more money than we have because we are poorer states. And that's the other difference, is that we don't have the resources. We've lost our media. We don't have the kind of business conglomerates you see on the coast. And I do wonder what the pandemic is going to do, because people are now fleeing these cities. They're fleeing New York or San Francisco or other places that have very high population density and where you're much more likely to catch the virus. And I don't know what that will mean for how the population of the United States is allocated, whether people will now go to where I live and see that as like the paradise. I mean, after the Lake of the Ozarks last week and Redhead Bar and Grill, I don't think so much, but you never know. But I think changes are in store. However, just to wrap this up, that's sort of a long-term thing that may happen as a result of the pandemic. The immediate problem is the election and its election integrity, and it's the hardening of these categories and the exploitation of them by bad actors, whether Republicans or Russians, who want to see America broken apart and will use the election itself as a means to that end. And so, yes, we need to push for voting by mail. We need to push for transparency and integrity in our elections. nations and for the preservation of our union. We cannot take that very essential thing that I think most of us grew up not thinking it would be shattered in our lifetime. We can't take that for granted anymore.
Yes. So there's two great biographies by Ron Chernow, Alexander Hamilton, which famously inspired the musical Hamilton, and Grant, on Ulysses S. Grant, the Civil War general for the North, for the Union, and both by Ron Chernow. What he did was he brought us into the lives of these two great forces of personality, Hamilton and Grant, and their greatest contributions were to unite these very different factions under a strong federal government. It takes a force of personality. If you read the Hamilton biography, it's stunning what Hamilton did, nearly killing himself, working himself to death to bring all of these different states with their very different cultures, mindsets. And on top of that, you had all of these Revolutionary War veterans that were poor and suffering and still injured, deeply wounded, psychologically, physically, that were threatening to form mobs to kill the baby in the cradle before this new country had a chance to even be born. And just the lengths he went to unite. Hamilton gets a great deal of credit of why America even exists in the first place as an America rather than a Europe. And then, of course, Grant did that famously with winning the Civil War. It takes personality, it takes strength of character to keep this country together. And what we have in the White House is the exact opposite of a Hamilton and a Grant. We have a traitor within our midst who just wants to enrich himself and just wants to vindictively rub our faces in his crimes and gets off on getting away with it. And he has children around him who are benefiting from that power, Ivanka and Jared and Don Jr., and they're going to continue on his dynasty because the Trump family brand is how they've made their money. That's how they've lived above accountability. That's how they've escaped investigations and so forth in the past. That's how they came to power. They whitewashed their crimes through reality television. And we've seen all that. They painted themselves as respectable people. All that sheen blinded the media in 2016. White supremacy is so core to their values and how they're allowed to get away with their crimes and scrutiny. And so it's a very scary time if the Trump crime family remains in power. So the solution to what we're saying is very simple. Get rid of Electoral College. Get rid of Electoral College. That's it. There is a growing movement that's legally based, that's trying very hard to finally get rid of Electoral College, which gave us the two most corrupt presidents in our history and in world history, George W. Bush and Donald Trump. And Godspeed to those movements.
I'm wondering, since we're talking about, media complicity and misrepresentation, should we talk about the Ronan Farrow situation, the New York Times?
Yes.
Okay, so you may have seen, it feels like a year ago, but about a week ago, Ben Smith, formerly of BuzzFeed, wrote a hit piece on journalist Ronan Farrow for the New York Times. And before I get into that hit piece, I'm going to give a little bit of background about one of the stories that I think has been dropped from the news from the last 2 years that I see as a major factor in this political situation that we're in now, which is Black Cube and similar mercenary outlets. So Black Cube is a brutal Israeli intelligence agency that has been hired by everybody from rapist Harvey Weinstein to Cambridge Analytica, the data mining company that rigs elections here and elsewhere, to members of the Russian mafia, and to Republicans who sought to sabotage the Obama administration's Iran deal and harassed people and threatened people in that administration. The tactics that Black Cube uses include blackmail, threats of violence, stalking, impersonating journalists in order to get close to targets, planting propaganda, tapping phones, and other means of surveillance and control. And this is a group that is working intimately with either people in governments or with those kind of hovering at the edges of various administrations and campaigns and doing the dirty work for them. Black Cube used to be something that Congress actually cared about. At one point, there were members of Congress seeking to hold hearings and investigations about Black Cube. Foremost among those who was investigating Black Cube was Elijah Cummings, the representative who died abruptly in 2019. And I'm just going to read the opening paragraphs of a letter he wrote on May 24th, 2018, just to give an idea of what he was doing. He's writing to the representatives from Black Cube. We are writing to request documents relating to reports that Black Cube conducted a, quote, dirty ops campaign against former Obama administration officials Ben Rhodes and Colin Kahl at the behest of associates of President Donald Trump. If these reports are accurate, they raise grave questions about how and why a foreign entity was engaged to attempt to secretly influence the foreign policy of the United States. On May 5th, 2018, The Guardian reported that your firm was engaged to, quote, orchestrate a dirty ops campaign against key individuals from the Obama administration who helped negotiate the Iran nuclear deal. A source with knowledge of your engagement reportedly stated, quote, the idea was that people acting for Trump would discredit those who were pivotal in selling the deal, making it easier to pull out of it. We have now obtained documents that appear to confirm that your firm attempted to obtain information about Mr. Rhodes and Mr. Kahl through their family members on multiple occasions. This isn't particularly true of Colin Kahl's wife, who they targeted directly. And so, I think it's worth looking at the full letter from Elijah Cummings, looking at that case, and looking how it was dropped. And so there's one person who did not drop the Black Cube story, and that is Ronan Farrow. So in 2019, Ronan Farrow wrote a firsthand account of how he was stalked and threatened by Black Cube agents to the point that he feared for his life. His experiences were captured in his book, Catch and Kill, which is the story of Harvey Weinstein's decades of rape and assault and how they were covered up by the mainstream media, particularly by NBC. As Farrow investigated the Weinstein case and the cover-up, more and more women came forward, and he learned that a number of media personalities, notably Matt Lauer, had also been accused of rape or sexual assault by multiple women over a long period of time. So, given the extent of incredible criminality at play, why would the New York Times, and specifically media analyst Ben Smith, write a hit piece on Ronan Farrow? Why would he be a target? And so, to briefly give some examples from Smith's op-ed, on May 17th, Smith argued that Farrow, quote, delivers narratives that are irresistibly cinematic, with unmistakable heroes and villains, but often omits the complicating facts and inconvenient details that may make them less dramatic. He then added, his work, though, reveals the weakness of a kind of resistance journalism that has thrived in the age of Donald Trump, that if reporters swim ably along with the tides of social media and produce damaging reporting about public figures most disliked by the loudest voices, the old rules of fairness and open-mindedness can seem more like impediments than essential journalistic imperatives. That can be a dangerous approach, particularly in a moment when the idea of truth and a shared set of facts is under assault. So, I'm reading this, and there's not really a lot of solid critiques in this op-ed about Farrow's reporting. He raises like a few kind of nitpicky questions that, I've read the book, and I kept thinking, like, did he read the book? Like, did he actually see a lot of these questions are answered within? But the main thing I was thinking when I read that passage is, guess who else was under assault? Ronan Farrow. And guess who was not mentioned at all in any capacity by Ben Smith in the New York Times? Black Cube. And so the omission itself of Black Cube is startling. But first, I just want to discuss what the hell, quote, resistance journalism means. Whatever it is, it's not political. Most of the people that Farrow has outed over his career have been Democratic officials like Eric Schneiderman or big donors to the Democratic Party like Harvey Weinstein. So this is not a partisan thing. This is not really an anti-Trump thing. What Smith seems to be arguing is that any kind of journalism, which is not sycophantic access journalism, is thereby, quote, resistance journalism. He's arguing that journalism should not challenge power. The old adage of journalism should afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted does not seem to apply to the New York Times. They hold a mentality very similar to that of Black Cube itself. that media does not exist as a means to relay truth to the public. It exists as a weapon. So I'm now going to read a passage from Ronan Farrow's Catch and Kill, in which he illuminates a conflict of interest between the New York Times, Black Cube, and his own reporting. This is from pages 314 to 315. He writes, Black Cube promised, quote, a dedicated team of expert intelligence officers that will operate in the USA and any other necessary country, including a project manager, intelligence analyst, linguists, and, quote, avatar operators specifically hired to create fake identities on social media, as well as, quote, operations experts with extensive experience in social engineering. The agency agreed to hire an investigative journalist as per the client requests, who would be required to conduct 10 interviews a month for 4 months and be paid $40,000. The agency would, quote, promptly report to the client the results of such interviews by the journalist. This is from a document that Farrow got, about Black Cube. Black Cube also promised to provide, quote, a full-time agent by the name of Anna, hereinafter the agent, who will be based in New York and Los Angeles as per the client's instructions, and who will be available full-time to assist the client and his attorneys for the next 4 months. The invoices attached were eye-popping, fees that might have totaled up to $1.3 million. The contracts were signed by Dr. Avi Llanos, the Black Cube director, and by Boyce Schiller. This was an astonishment. Boyce's law firm represented the New York Times, but here was the esteemed lawyer's signature in genteel blue-inked cursive on a contract to kill the paper's reporting and obtain McGowan's book. That's Rose McGowan, the actress and victim of Harvey Weinstein. And so that information, that very pertinent fact that Black Cube and the Times share a lawyer, that was also left out of Ben Smith's article. So, I mean, I just was left reading this like, what are you even doing? I think some of this is a broadside against, quote, resistance journalism, formerly known as journalism. When you investigate those in power, investigate wrongdoings, try to bring the truth to light and so forth. But there also seems something more nefarious here in terms of the omission of these direct connections between Black Cube and the Times, and the complete omission of Black Cube from the article itself, which parallels a refusal to cover Black Cube and its history of interfering with foreign policy, with elections and so forth at all. Do you have thoughts on that?
Oh my gosh. I mean, this whole Ben Smith nitpicking wannabe takedown of Ronan Farrow in the New York Times, first of all, in terms of what he had issue with in his long investigation into Ronan Farrow, it came out as that Abbott and Costello skit, Who's on First? It was that confusing. It was so in the weeds. And thank you to the New Yorker editor, Ronan Farrow's editor at the New Yorker, that painstakingly went into those weeds and fact-checked every one of them and had a ironclad response, going down the list. But in terms of for the general public that should be serviced by the noble profession of journalism, the general public doesn't care about journalists going after journalists in this fashion. This is very much an inside baseball takedown by a journalist for other journalists. This is like a clubhouse conversation. And that's also what makes it so privileged and abysmal during a time when so many are hurting, especially the most vulnerable communities who we're seeing have the highest death toll, the greatest dangers in this once-in-a-century pandemic, communities of color and immigrant communities. And here you have Ben Smith basically acting out that scene in American Psycho where they sit around comparing the texture and font of their business cards. This is how this played out. And the reason why it got so much airtime is because, again, this was by a journalist written for journalists. And it was just like a country club magazine. And one thing that it really urgently signaled was that media reporting, the facts, the objective facts, that is all fine and well. We need media reporting. Media columns, on the other hand, where there's score settling. This column felt like it was born among media types like Ben Smith and other fancy, highly respectable media people over drinks somewhere in some bar. This feels very much like it was a conversation among fancy media people, and they took themselves very seriously. And they said, yes, that is exactly what the world needs, a Ronan Farrow takedown. And they took it seriously because they had no one around them to check them, and they went forward with it. And it sucked the oxygen out of the room when it came out because Twitter is filled with media people all talking about it and chatting about it because it's so inside the clubhouse. And the reality is that investigative journalism is absolutely messy because you're chasing down stories that may never bear any fruit. Investigative journalism is incredibly expensive and time-consuming, and that is also what makes it expensive. Plus, in many cases, you need to travel, and plus, you need resources to documents, which could cost money to unlock. It's just a very time-consuming, resource-heavy pursuit, and that is why in the decades of shrinking newsrooms, this epidemic of shrinking newsrooms, especially the loss of local news being at the forefront of fighting corruption, in this massive epidemic of the loss of newsroom jobs, investigative journalism is often the first to go because it is so time-consuming and there's no guarantee of payout. You could chase down sources that then suddenly dry up on you, or there's nothing there, or it's just too dangerous, or you get intimidated, as we saw with Black Cube. Ronan Farrow is very, very privileged, but he used his privilege wisely in this case. So with NBC News shutting down his investigation, Ronan Farrow had the name. Ronan Farrow had the clout to jump to the New Yorker. When a Ronan Farrow phone call comes in, editors at the New Yorker are going to take that call. They might definitely not take a call from me or Sarah, but they would take a email from Ronan Farrow. So he used his clout wisely to jump to the New Yorker, and that allowed his massive investigation to see the light of day. And he also had celebrity protection. Black Cube was going after him. Black Cube went after a lot of celebrities. That intimidation certainly worked. We know that because Ronan Farrow documented it. At the same time, Ronan Farrow was able to rise above it because he had that power of celebrity. He was able to use his powerful platform to speak the truth. And plus, he was a newcomer to this industry. He had worked previously, he had a degree from Yale Law School. He worked at the State Department. He was fairly new to investigative journalism. And it was sort of that not coming up in that world certainly gave him a fresher perspective where he was able to really go for the jugular here, not caring who he took down in the process. So that freshness certainly worked in his favor. And I think over the years, as Ronan Farrow, this golden boy, was rising, we see now the jealousy, the career jealousy. We see now how many talks over beers happened during that time over these journalists, poking fun at Ronan Farrow. It all expressed itself in this confusing Abbott and Costello, who's on first, nitpicking in the weeds, attempted takeout at Ronan Farrow, which got completely ridiculed across the board by so many people across Twitter, namely many people who are not in media, who are like, what the hell are you guys talking about? The house is on fire, and you're making fun of someone that attempted to pick up a hose and put it out.
Yeah, and he actually, had the bravery to do that. Like, the book is very interesting. Like, I'd read it before. I was mostly kind of skimming it through to learn about different areas that were of interest to me, in my own work. This time I just really sat down and read it very closely, line by line, to try if I could see, what is Ben Smith even getting at? And there are so many disturbing details in there. There are so many kind of mini stories that aren't fully resolved, I think, through no fault of Farrow. I think just because they're supporting details to a broader argument. For example, early in the book, he is describing how he interviewed Gwen Stefani and, he says, I asked Gwen Stefani if she vaccinated her kids and how she felt about the anti-vaxxers. She said she supported vaccines and advised people to talk to their doctors. Mike Wallace at your doors, this was not, but back at Rockefeller Plaza, assembling the spot and edit, I got a call from an MSNBC producer working on the concert. Stefani's people have reviewed the transcript and they like some edits, she said. Who sent them a transcript? I don't know. In my inbox was a red-line transcript with Stefani's sound bites rearranged and trimmed to make it sound like she was ambivalent to negative on the vaccine front. I told the producer I wouldn't air it. And so then after that, Ronan Farrow gets in a dispute with his employers at MSNBC because he refused to doctor a conversation to make it not just reflect the opposite of what Gwen Stefani said, but not make it be a very harmful propaganda position. And this, of course, stood out to me because we're in the midst of a pandemic. We're in a time where there is contradictory health information as well as conspiracies, flying all around this country, where media has been gutted. It was already gutted going into the pandemic. There have been about 30,000 journalists that have since lost their jobs or been furloughed. It's very easy for disinformation to get out, particularly on things like vaccines, where you already have this history of conspiracy. And to hear, that that's what NBC was doing, that they were fabricating things to appease the anti-vaxxer movement. I'm like, wow, that in itself is a story, and it's not one that he completes telling because it's not the main focus of his book. And the whole book is filled with things like that. It is filled with the corruption of media. It is filled with anecdotes about these interrelated corporate entities, law firms, and legacy outlets, and mercenary intelligence apparati, and political campaigns, and Hollywood elites, and so on and so forth. How it's all, as George Carlin said, it's one big club, and you're not in it. And I think that some of the antipathy toward Ronan Farrow is that he could have been in that club. He could have just kept his mouth shut. He could have kissed people's ass, and he didn't. He extracted himself from the situation, and he told the truth. And, I don't want to get too much into this, but that's what he did when he was protecting his sister against Woody Allen and, outing Woody Allen as a predator. So, and he's straightforward in the book about how, to some degree, this is personal for him, but he also brings evidence. He brings documentation, and it's just bizarre. Like, of all the people to target in this way, it's like one of the very few from this kind of privileged class who's really doing a good job and putting his life on the line. I mean, that comes through very clearly in the book. And it's always weird to me when someone has a dramatic story to tell, like Ronan Farrow, that involves his life being in peril, that involves being threatened and stalked and harmed and losing his job and all these genuinely bad things. And people get jealous. They get jealous that this kind of attention is being showered on you. And I've seen this much more with women. It's almost the same reaction that when women come forward and they speak out against sexual assault, and you see people saying, oh, well, you just want the attention. You just want your name to be in the media. It's like, my God, no. Like, I've already been through a trauma. Now I have to relive that trauma on a national stage with a bunch of people who don't believe me, who are determined to assassinate my character, and who are still threatening me. Like, I kept wondering about that. Is Black Cube still threatening Ronan Farrow? Are other people threatening him, threatening the New Yorker, and so on? Because I've definitely seen a drop off, as I said, in coverage of things like Black Cube and similar mercenary outlets. So yeah, that's just something to consider.
This reads like NBC fighting back, because Ben Smith's attempted takedown of Ronan Farrow was followed by Matt Lauer coming out with his own column on the heels of this one, trying to say, yeah, so Matt Lauer tried to pile on. And the public was just not having it. And Gwen Stefani, who you mentioned just now in this example, Gwen Stefani works at NBC. She's a star of the NBC show The Voice, or she was. I don't follow that stuff, but it's like I did back in the day. But, so it's like this very much reads like NBC fighting back against the serious double black eyes that Ronan Farrow gave them with his reporting. And on top of that, you have in Ben Smith's own piece a disclosure that he provides where he writes, "Disclosure, I don't cover BuzzFeed extensively in this column because I retain stock options in the company, which I left in February. I've agreed to divest those options by the end of the year." Now, according to NBC News, this is me now pointing this out, according to NBC News, NBC Universal, which owns NBC News, has a $400 million investment in BuzzFeed. Ben Smith and BuzzFeed, it's like when you're talking about BuzzFeed, you're talking about Ben Smith. When you're talking about, it's like they're so linked. And here he is at the New York Times now, their media columnist, including writing an article essentially praising the New York Times and how successful it is. He did that column. So again, media columnists should not come from the world of media. The only people qualified to critique the media are those who are most vulnerable among us, because they're the ones in the positions of power and authority to remind the media the sole job of journalism is a public service. It's to speak truth to power. It is to hold power accountable. Only the most vulnerable in society should be media columnists. A reporter or anybody from media being a media columnist is just masturbation. That's all it is at the end of the day.
Yeah, and we should note that the New York Times got rid of their public editor. Their last public editor was Liz Spade, who had come out, and criticized quite heavily how the New York Times covered Trump and Russia in 2016. After that was reprimanded, then they eliminated the position entirely, saying that, the public would be responsible for critiquing the New York Times. Now, we all know, what happens when anybody tries to do that on Twitter, including other journalists as well as readers. There is a mob pile-on by writers and editors of the New York Times, which people attribute to fragile ego. But there have been enough internal conversations leaked from the New York Times, published online, that show that, I'm not sure every person working there is a willing participant in this kind of mob mentality, because there are good journalists there and they're really just trapped in this corporate culture. But it's amazing to me the way they see a power differential, where if somebody is critiquing, for example, Maggie Haberman's sycophantic court intrigue type columns about the wonders of Ivanka and Jared, that rando on Twitter will get pummeled by like a shitload of New York Times employees, like among the most privileged media employees in America. They will descend en masse and, say basically that you have no right to a critique. Meanwhile, you've got Roger Stone like wishing Maggie Haberman's child a happy birthday on Twitter. And I just look at all this and I'm like, something's deeply awry here. Like, if Roger Stone knew when my kids were born and was like sending them birthday greetings, like I'd be reevaluating what I'm doing with my life. And if I were working for a publication like that, that's like, sharing a lawyer with Black Cube, that's slandering the reporters that are actually doing the hard work, like I would wonder about the nature of that company, about its financial interest, its political interest, because this is not an isolated incident. We've discussed the New York Times, its Nazi puff pieces, its lies about Trump and Russia and the FBI and so on and so forth. We've been discussing this for years. It's highbrow, Breitbart. It's rather exceptional in this way. Every publication makes mistakes. Nobody's perfect. We've criticized other places, but there's very few that are so continual in this pattern of subversion and of, trying to cover up the truth instead of cover it as the New York Times. And it's shameful. And I wish that folks would just, focus on those who are doing a good job. People like Ronan Farrow, his, sometimes partner at the New Yorker, Jane Meyer, is an excellent writer, obviously about dark money, but on other issues as well. Lift those voices up and let the legacy publications that don't live up to their own reputation just drown in their own cesspool that they've devised. I mean, that's the inevitable outcome.
Yeah. And you're going to inevitably make mistakes. You're going to inevitably get some things wrong. You acknowledge it, you correct it, you move on. And that's what Ronan Farrow did in the very messy, time-consuming, intense process of investigative journalism. All journalists know that. Basically, Ben Smith, he couldn't survive his own scrutiny here by any means. And his own reporters have been attacked the way Ronan Farrow has. I was shocked at Jason Leopold for holding up this article, going, when Jason Leopold had some stupid CNN reporter calling him out for his, struggles with drug addiction in the past and trying to strike at his credibility. So journalists do this to journalists. It's a highly competitive industry. It's a highly social industry. It very much depends on who you know. And therefore, editors at big platforms with respectable names, they wield a lot of power. A lot of people want to take them out for drinks. They get a lot of really fashionable invitations. And so you have a lot of stupid social tensions there and a lot of score settling and competition. I hate being in conversation with New York journalists and hearing them nitpick each other. It just sounds extraordinarily shallow and tone deaf compared to what's happening across America right now. And the fact that journalists are a dying breed. I know personally far too many extraordinarily talented journalists and editors who are stuck working in big corporations, in advertising, in copywriting, in PR, because there simply aren't any jobs. And the fact that those that remain in positions of power at places like the New York Times that aren't sensitive to that, aren't using their power more responsibly, it's just so infuriating. I can't even begin to tell you. And the only thing bringing me any comfort in this is the fact that I've studied cases like this up close in the many years I spent researching my film, Mr. Jones, which looks at character assassination by a powerful editor, the Moscow bureau chief of the New York Times, Walter Duranty. And I saw where journalists in the early 1930s fell on, which side of history they fell on. And I'm telling you, history will be the final judge. Journalists today, they have to check their privilege. They have to force themselves to be conscious that they live a very comfortable life and not to be cloistered in that life to the point where history will judge them rightly, in a way that will be very harsh if they lose sight of what matters right now. To really illustrate this, this whole Ben Smith attempt to take down a Ronan Farrow, it so strikes me as clever guerrilla marketing for my film. Because here you have, young Gareth Jones, a total outsider of this cushy, cloistered world of journalism. He didn't care. He came in and he was slaying dragons, just like Ronan Farrow was, as this outsider coming in, slaying dragons and just taking people down with very little thought for his life and his career. Then you have some very privileged, powerful name at the New York Times, Walter Duranty, trying to take down Gareth Jones, like Ben Smith tried to take down Ronan Farrow. There were hit pieces written against Gareth Jones, the star of my film. And so I was watching all this play out and I was like, wow, this is really clever guerrilla marketing for my film, Mr. Jones, which is available now for rental and coming June 19th. But really, that's what I was thinking. And if you think about his stupidity, Ben Smith's stupidity of calling out quote unquote resistance journalism, Walter Duranty, the villain of my film, played beautifully by Peter Sarsgaard, he was the ultimate resistance journalist. He was in the pocket of the Kremlin and feeding the readers of the New York Times all this propaganda about how great Stalin was, how Stalin was trudging along and building the great Soviet utopia. And of course, there was some reports of famine, but you can't make an omelet without breaking eggs. So you had this resistance journalism staunchly on the side of the Soviets in believing in their great socialist experiment, believing in Stalin, feeding these lies, feeding the Soviet propaganda to the readers of the New York Times. Walter Duranty is a resistance journalist. So Ben Smith should take a crack at writing about actual resistance journalism and leave investigative journalism alone.
Yeah, I mean, I think it just depends on well, what are we resisting here? And if what you're resisting is white collar crime, organized crime, mercenary groups, authoritarian regimes, state corruption, corporate corruption, et cetera, then, today you get branded, quote, resistance journalism for doing the baseline set of expectations for you, as a journalist ostensibly investigating powerful and relevant figures. But yeah, I see the kind of characterization, you can take it either way. If Duranty is seen as somebody resisting the United States in its, ostensibly democratic system by supporting the Soviets and totalitarian communist dictators, then yeah, that is its own form of resistance. I mean, that's why it's just such an absurd turn of phrase, because it's never defined. It's meant to be weaponized. It's no surprise to me that another Walter Duranty of our times, Glenn Greenwald, went on to write a long harangue about the evils of resistance journalism, in which he put a number of, effective voices hung out to dry. Marcy Wheeler, Empty Wheel from Twitter, among them. She formerly, I think, worked for the umbrella organization that Greenwald works for at The Intercept, and she's very good at analyzing, legal cases regarding, civil liberties and things like that. But she was not a Russiagate denialist like Greenwald, so that's her cardinal sin. And so, they use this all the time. I mean, this is an old play. They've been doing this at You and I, Andrea, for ages. We get cover stories called The New Paranoia for daring to suggest in 2017, that Trump was an aspiring autocrat, that Trump had been dealing with Russia, that his interests did not put the American people first and foremost. Like, that's literally, those were the things that, I believe that was the New Republic, that they got upset about us saying. They thought that those were such outlandish claims to make, whereas they were very obvious claims to make, and they were based on our decades of experience in studying autocracies, which is what, both Andrea and I did before we began studying the US and studying how the United States under Trump was engaged in this axis of autocrats. It's very bizarre. It's an interesting phenomenon to see the media weaponizing itself against the other members of the media who are trying to hold the powerful to account, especially when those powerful people have absolutely no redeeming characteristics. They are hyper-capitalists, they are oligarchs, they are mafiosos, they are white supremacists. Like, there isn't anything good that they're offering to the world except access, money, and power. So if you are a defender of these individuals, if you're going out of your way to help people, whether it's, Jared Kushner or Trump or Harvey Weinstein or Matt Lauer or all of the, I should have added sexual predators into that list of categories I just said, then, what exactly are you working for? What's it worth to you? What part of you are you sacrificing in order to protect these individuals? And what effect does that work have on society, whether it's your refusal to cover these topics, to cover these crimes, and to cover these criminals, or to slander those reporters that are doing so? I wish that they would think long and hard about that.
I want to add, Sarah and I started this podcast knowing full well we were going to, the attacks against us would, and the disinformation against us would continue, because that's all we're pretty much used to at this point. And we did it anyway, knowing that the truth would protect us. If we just stick to what we know, if we just stand in our truth, the truth will protect us. And that's just a simple fact that we cling to in the work that we do. We very much work towards the judgment of history. We want to be remembered on the right side of history. I wish more journalists thought that way. We would have a much healthier environment. We wouldn't have these stories polluting the information space. And just to really bring that home to the journalists out there, I want to play a clip from a BBC documentary where a man in his golden years, a British man, is being confronted by an interviewer for this documentary about the hit pieces that he wrote as a young journalist, discrediting and spreading lies and propaganda against George Orwell's comrades in the Spanish Civil War, a group of communists that were also staunchly anti-Stalin, staunchly anti-dictatorship, but they were smeared widely in the Western press, including by the New York Times, as fascists. And that was the collective madness of the day. That was the gaslighting that drove Orwell to write Homage to Catalonia, which fact-checked and confronted that gaslighting. And even later, when Orwell was sitting with Hemingway in Paris talking about how he was nearly arrested in Spain, where he saw his friends kidnapped and killed in Spain. Orwell, all those years later, sitting on the verge of the end of World War II, we're talking about like 1945, all those years later, Hemingway hands him a pistol in Paris to protect himself should anybody want to kill Orwell all these years later, because he was, quote unquote, on the side of the fascists. He was fighting alongside people in Spain that were anti-fascist, anti-dictatorship, but they were so widely smeared by the respectable press as being fascist that their lives were in danger. And Orwell lived with that terror so many years after he had been in Spain. That's how deeply this gaslighting goes for people on the front lines for fighting for the truth. And so for the journalists out there who are careerists, who care about being fashionable and being respectable and all of that at this great sacrifice of the truth itself, heed this warning. Do not live your life where a tenacious filmmaker, journalist could come and confront you about the stuff that you're writing right now. So we're going to play this clip of a man being confronted about the hit pieces he wrote, smearing the anti-fascists as fascists that Orwell fought alongside in Spain.
You see, what I'm getting at is that shook, the May events in Barcelona shook Orwell's faith in communism very seriously. I mean, it was the most important political thing that happened to him. It doesn't seem to have had quite that effect on you. Would you say that was the case? It hasn't really broken your faith?
Mind you, I didn't really have all the information that Orwell had at the time anyway. I mean, this business about the Russians wanting to have a pact with Britain and France at that time, I mean, this never rather impinged upon my probably very innocent political outlook. No, I'm all a bit deep for me at that time, I think.
Our discussion continues, and you can get access to that by signing up on our Patreon at the Truth Teller level or higher.
We want to encourage you to donate to your local food bank, which is experiencing a spike in demand. We also encourage you to donate to Direct Relief at directrelief.org, which is supplying much-needed protective gear to first responders working on the front lines in the U.S., China, and other hard-hit parts of the world.
We encourage you to donate to the International Rescue Committee, a humanitarian relief organization helping refugees from Syria. Donate at rescue.org. And if you want to help critically endangered orangutans already under pressure from the palm oil industry, donate to the Orangutan Project at theorangutanproject.org. Gaslit Nation is produced by Sarah Kenzier and Andrea Chalupa. If you like what we do, leave us a review on iTunes. It helps us reach more listeners. And check out our Patreon, it keeps us going.
Our production managers are Nicholas Torres and Carlin Daigle. Our episodes are edited by Nicholas Torres, and our Patreon exclusive content is edited by Carlin Daigle.
Original music in Gaslit Nation is produced by David Whitehead, Martin Vissenberg, Nick Farr, Damian Arriaga, and Carlin Daigle. Our logo design was donated to us by Hamish Smith of the New York-based firm Order. Thank you so much, Hamish. Gaslit Nation would like to thank our supporters at the producer level on Patreon: Adam Levine,
Alabama,
Alan Liu,
and Marshall,
Brian Tahuden,
Carol Gulstad,
Catherine Anderson Carena,
David Porter,
Diana Gallagher,
D.L. Singfield,
Dorothy Kamarick,
Doug Friedenberg,
Elizabeth Dove,
Emmy,
Eric Kaplan,
Arena Guardia,
Ethan Mann,
Evan Rosemore,
Fontaine Carpenter,
George Hughes,
Gustav Halsby,
Janet Robinson,
Jared Lombardo,
Jason Benke,
Jason Rita,
Jeff Thompson,
Jennifer Slavic,
Jens Alstrup Rasmussen,
Jons Alstrup Rasmussen. The name's so nice,
fine.
You say it twice. Joel Newman,
John Astrick,
John Laughlin,
John Ripley,
Karen Humphreys,
Kate Cotton,
Katie McHugh,
Katie Musiris,
Keith Gottschalk,
Kelly Ranson,
Kevin Gannon,
Kevin M. Garnett,
Christy Vitale,
Lawrence Graham,
Leo Chalupa, so sing-songy,
Lindsay Eggleston,
Lisa LaFlame,
Lorraine W. Todd,
Luke Stranded,
Lynn Schneider,
Mandy Farrapore,
Marcus J. Trent,
Margaret Moe,
Mary Wong,
Matt Perez,
Maureen Murphy,
Michael Stinoff,
Michael Woodridge,
Michelle Dash, Mike
Tripico,
Nicole Spear,
Oliver Ash,
Pamela Newport,
Ray Alba,
Rhonda White,
Rich Craw,
Richard Smith,
Sandra Kalnins,
Sonia Bogdanovic,
Sharon Hattrick,
Solomon Hikes,
Tanya Chalupa,
Tracy,
Victoria Nordgren,
Victoria Olson,
William Barry Reeves,
Ren,
Zachary Lemon.
Thank you all so much for your support. We could not make the show without you.